for coming to this seminar. Today we have a guest from the United States, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Professor Roy Gane, who is also a very good friend by now. And I will introduce him a little bit in short. Professor Roy Gane was basically born in Australia, and at the age of 7 he moved to the United States, where he did all his studies and established his beautiful family. He is today a full professor at the Old Testament department of the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary in Andrews University in Berrien Springs in Michigan, United States. And Professor Gane studied in the following schools. He had his BA in 1977 in Theology and Music from Pacific Union College in California, and then he had his MA in 1983 in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, where he also had his PhD in Biblical Hebrew language and literature. And during his studies, he also spent some time in Jerusalem, which makes this very familiar thing for me and happy. And his knowledge of ancient languages as well as modern Hebrew increased while he was staying there, I believe. Among Professor Gane's most important publications are at least 4 books, and I have here Old Testament Law for Christians, which I actually don't have. During his study, and was published in 2017 by Baker Academic, and then in 2005 he published the book Cult and Character, Purification Offerings, Day of Atonement, and Theodicy, which came out by Eisenbrauns. I will move it around in a minute, and basically he told me that he sees that as his most important volume. And in 2004 he published what was actually his PhD dissertation, Ritual Dynamic Structure by Georgia Dissertations, Georgia Press. And then I don't have that one, Leviticus Numbers application commentary in 2004 as well. We have it in the library, but I did not bring it with me. And then Professor Gane also published edited books. In 2012 he published Homosexuality, Marriage and Church, Biblical Counseling and Religious Liberty Issues, and that was published by Andrew University. And then in 2015 we published together, we edited a volume, Current Issues in Priestly and Related Literature, The Legacy of Jacob Milgrom and Beyond, which most of the students of Milgrom participated in. And so there are numerous essays and articles published during the years by Professor Gane, and I don't have the list here. It's really huge. Professor Gane has focused his study on the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern rituals, and showed the correlations between those different cultures in the sphere of the cult. His lecture today also relates to rituals at the cults of Gane, or ancient Near East, and Israel. Professor Gane, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. I'm just delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation and for all the support and help you've given to get me here. And we had an interesting adventure, which we can talk about later, with a plane having to turn around and go back because of a generator failure. And so I'm glad to be just barely here. But thank you for helping me get here. And it's been really wonderful to work with Dr. Cohen in two major ways. She's been the chair for years of the Ritual in the Biblical World section of the Society of Biblical Literature. And so I was part of that committee working under her and with her for a number of years, and we're still collaborating on that. And that was very rewarding and wonderful. We have a great team on that steering committee, including former steering committee members that still are in touch, and I'm glad you keep in touch with us. And then also, especially collaborating on this volume, Current Issues in Priestly and Related Literature. It was the Milgram Memorial Volume. My teacher was Jacob Milgram. He died in 2010, and so his widow was very happy that we produced this memorial volume. It was a lot of work, and it was interesting. We were collaborating from two different sides of the world, literally. And I was thinking, if there was a nuclear explosion and it blew up one half of the world, we could still publish the volume because there would be a backup on the other side of the world. So we were in two totally different time zones. It's amazing to live in this day and age when we can collaborate at such a distance. So I have great respect for Dr. Cohen and what she's done. You're very, very fortunate to have her here. She's making a fine contribution in the scholarly world in general, and I'm just thrilled to be here and honored to be here. Thank you. And I'm honored to be in your beautiful country of Japan. I have great admiration for Japan. I have a Japanese car, Toyota Corolla. I don't think I would buy anything but a Japanese car because it's very high quality. Today I flew across by Mount Fuji, saw some of the beauty of the country. It was just lovely. So let's get into the topic, shall we? The topic I have today, and you have the paper, I think a copy of it in front of you so you can follow along. I will try not to read too fast. And the topic is the God who is affected by human problems, atonement through Israelite purification offerings. So first the introduction. Ancient Near Eastern, and after this I'm going to say A-N-E for the Ancient Near East or Ancient Near Eastern, okay? So just A-N-E, not A-N-A, that's something else, right? That's your airline. Ancient Near Eastern peoples were keenly aware of categories that could be regarded as sin, that is, moral fault, which could be viewed as moral impurity. And they were also aware of other kinds of impurity, such as physical ritual impurity or demonic impurity. Because sin could be viewed as defiling, the overall category of impurity in general included sin. Both sin and other forms of impurity were to be avoided if possible and remedied if necessary, because they could negatively impact relationships between A&E people and deities, whose favor was essential for their well-being. Sin is fairly easy to define as violation of a divine norm, a norm or standard or something like that. A general definition of other impurity that applies within all A&E cultural contexts is more elusive, more difficult, and is still subject to debate. However, we can tentatively suggest that such impurity was basically some kind of disorder that involved one or more extraordinary factors, such as a superhuman source, such as a demon, an adverse effect on the relationship between a human being and a superhuman being, or the need for a remedy that transcended ordinary human ability. So it goes beyond just ordinary dirt, like you would just wash off in an ordinary mundane situation. The present paper will first establish an overall perspective and baseline for comparison by identifying concepts regarding sins and other kinds of impurities in the A&E outside Israel. Then the remainder of the paper will compare and contrast ways in which the ancient Israelite ritual system dealt with these evils, including through purification offerings, that uniquely revealed the way in which Israel's deity, and I'll say Adonai, I'm spelling it here YHWH, which is the tetragrammaton that a lot of scholars think is probably pronounced something like Yahweh. But when I get to that, I'll just say Adonai, but you'll see Yahweh this is the transliteration of the Hebrew letters in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, these are ways that revealed that Israel's deity made himself vulnerable to human weaknesses in the process of remedying them. So what the next section does is to give examples of sins of ancient Near Eastern peoples, the way they viewed sin, and some examples of texts in which those are found. However, let's skip over to the summary on page 5. The paper is a little bit long to fit into the time we have, so we're just going to summarize on page 5 the first full paragraph. Now we can summarize several key aspects of ANE thought regarding sin. First, sinful violations of divine norms could be cultic or ethical. Second, punishments for sin could affect individuals or groups, and punishment affecting a whole country could be referred to as resulting from guilt borne by the land. Third, some divine judgments did not allow for atonement. Fourth, the success of attempted atonement depended on the will of deities. It wasn't automatic. Fifth, various strategies for atonement could be attempted, including expiatory rituals and gifts for propitiation and reparation to remedy specific known offenses, and or offerings and other forms of worship to regain divine favor in general. Sixth, people could suffer divine punishment without knowing what they had done wrong. So now we're going to skip over the next section, which is other impurities of ancient Near Eastern peoples, and I'll just read the first few lines, and then we're going to skip the examples. ANE peoples were concerned about a wide variety of impurities. Mesopotamians and Hittites generally thought that impurities came from the underworld, and should be returned there if possible. Mesopotamians viewed such impurities as demonic. And then I give a number of examples, and especially talking about Hittite impurity, because the Hittites were especially obsessed with various kinds of impurities. So I did talk about that in the text, especially the Hittite instructions for temple officials, which has been published by Professor Cohen with a lot of discussion of details there. And so that's really an excellent resource on that. Now we're going to skip over to the bottom of page 9, the very last 2 lines on page 9. And that's the last thing that we're going to skip. Now we're going to continue through the rest of the paper. We can now summarize some points regarding ANE conceptions and treatment of impurity that was not sin, keeping in mind that ANE cultures differed somewhat in their views of impurity. First, impurities could be physical, social, or superhuman in origin and nature. Second, physical impurities that were seemingly mundane carried additional significance in cultic contexts because they could affect relationships with deities. Third, impurities were generally to be avoided if possible, but if they were incurred, they were to be remedied by means of appropriate purification rituals. Fourth, while impurity itself was not sin, and incurring an impurity could be permitted, violation of a rule concerning impurity was sinful. Fifth, impurity was opposed to holiness, so it had to be kept out of temples and sacred objects if possible. But if they became polluted, they were to become ritually purified, or in some cases, objects lost their sanctity and had to be discarded. The next section, and really for the remainder of the paper, we're going to be talking about impurities, including sins of ancient Israelites. But I wanted to establish a baseline first of comparison with the ancient Near East and just establish the various categories that we're going to be looking at in the Israelite system. Concepts and treatment of sins and other impurities affecting ancient Israelites, according to the Hebrew Bible, are similar in many ways to those of these evils elsewhere in the A&E, although there are some differences. This section summarizes the same kinds of points regarding Israelite sins and impurities that were earlier observed in the context of the rest of the A&E, thereby showing comparisons and contrasts. First, sins of ancient Israelites. First, sins could be violations of cultic rules, such as the prohibition against eating the meat of a well-being offering on the third day after it is slaughtered and offered to God. On the other hand, sins could be violations of ethical principles, such as those of the Ten Commandments and laws related to them. Second, punishments for sins could fall on individuals or on groups, including the entire Israelite nation. Furthermore, sexual offenses, idolatry, and murder morally polluted the land, ultimately leading to exile of the people from the land if enough of this moral impurity accumulated there. Another kind of moral pollution was the automatic defilement of the sanctuary from a distance, if an Israelite or resident alien living in the land offered any of his children to the god Moloch, or if someone deliberately committed the sin of failing to undergo purification from impurity that they received from a corpse. The penalty for these sins was the divinely administered punishment of being cut off from one's people, that is, forfeiting one's afterlife. Third, some divine judgments by Adonai did not allow for Israelites to receive atonement through expiatory sacrifices, although he could mercifully forgive apart from sacrifice. There was no sacrificial expiation for those whose serious sins incurred the terminal penalty of being cut off, including those who committed high-handed sins, that is, in defiance of Adonai. By the way, Adonai means Lord in Hebrew, and that's really a euphemism, really following the Septuagint, which always translates the Tetragrammaton, that is the four-letter name of Israel's personal deity, that is his personal name. They always translate that by Kyrios, which is the same as Adonai, it means Lord. Okay, continuing. On the Day of Atonement, all Israelites and non-Israelite resident aliens were to gain moral purification as a result of the purgation of the sanctuary when they showed loyalty to Adonai by practicing self-denial through fasting, etc., and by abstaining from all work. But those who failed to do this were to be cut off or destroyed. Thus, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was Israel's judgment day. Fourth, as elsewhere in the A&E, the success of an Israelite in gaining atonement depended on the will of the deity. Atonement did not automatically result from performance of an expiatory ritual like a kind of magic. Divine acceptance of a sacrifice was necessary for atonement. Forgiveness to complete the process of atonement, that is, reconciliation, was granted by Adonai himself, following an expiatory sacrifice officiated by a priest, as in Leviticus 4:26, for example. Thus the priest shall make expiation for him from his sin, and he will be forgiven. That's my translation. The priest made expiation, that is, removing the consequences of the sin from the sinner, but he was not authorized to forgive the sinner. The implied agent of the passive expression, he will be forgiven, is Adonai himself, who alone could forgive because it was his law that had been violated. While such forgiveness was not automatic, God promised that he would grant it if the sacrifice was properly performed. However, this assumes that the sinner is sincere and repentant. Elsewhere in the Bible, Adonai rejects sacrifices and other forms of worship, even prayers, offered by hypocritical individuals. See especially Isaiah 1:11-15. Fifth, Israelites could seek atonement in various ways, especially including expiatory sacrifices, some of which followed confession, and some of which followed payment of reparation to the wronged party. Unlike other A&E peoples, repentant Israelites who offered the types of sacrifices specified for their kinds of offenses by Adonai's ritual law were guaranteed atonement. A sinner who committed so great a wrong that its penalty was terminal, whether death or cutting off, with no kind of animal sacrifice available to expiate it, could nevertheless pray to God, confessing the sin and pleading for reconciliation. Kings David and Manasseh received divine mercy in this way. Individuals who were ignorant of what they had done wrong, but whose experiences led them to believe that they must have sinned, could receive expiation through reparation offerings. Sixth, a person could experience results of divine displeasure without knowing the nature of his or her offense. However, this should have been rare, because Adonai, unlike other A&E deities, made a unique covenant or treaty with a nation, in this case Israel, and the covenant stipulations consisted of laws that specified in detail what he wanted his people to do or not do. That's completely unique in the ancient Near East to have that kind of a covenant with stipulations like that. It is true that other A&E peoples also had laws, such as the laws of Hammurabi and the Hittite laws. Such regulations governed various kinds of behaviors, violation of which could be regarded as crimes, or as sins in the sense that the social order governed by a human ruler was viewed as subject to the overall jurisdiction of the gods. However, there was a much more direct connection between the biblical laws and the will of the one deity, Adonai, than there was between the other A&E law collections and any particular deities. The fact that Israelite religion was monotheistic greatly simplified matters for people who believed that they had sinned, because they did not need to employ diviners to figure out which superhuman being they had offended. Further reducing uncertainty and stress, Israelites who unintentionally violated divine commandments were required to offer expiatory purification or reparation offerings only when they came to know what they had done wrong. Those who perceived that they were experiencing negative consequences of sins without knowing what they had done wrong could offer a particular kind of sacrifice, a reparation offering, to remedy the problem. Other impurities of ancient Israelites is the next section. First, for the Israelites, non-moral impurities did not come from the underworld, as it did with the Hittites and the Babylonians. Nor were they demonic in origin. Rather, some came from contact with certain impure species of animals when they were dead, but most of them originated from physical conditions and activities of human beings. Human impurities were notable manifestations of the birth to death cycle of human mortality, including corpses, male or female genital flows, or surface disease, commonly referred to as leprosy, including scaly skin disease on persons, as well as outbreaks of mold or other kinds of fungus on garments or houses. In biblical narratives, Adonai sometimes punished people by afflicting them with skin disease. But although the origin of the impurity was superhuman, the impurity itself affected physical conditions. Non-moral Israelite impurities were conceptual in the sense that they involved categories rather than just ordinary physical dirt. For example, washing a corpse could not make it pure. However, impurities were physical in the sense that they could adhere to Israelite persons, objects, or places. Social evils, such as slander, were treated as sins rather than as other kinds of impurities. Second, as in other A&E countries, some physical impurities that were seemingly mundane carried additional significance in Israelite cultic contexts. Israelite priests were required to wash their hands and feet with water drawn from the sacred basin in the sanctuary courtyard before they entered the sacred sanctuary tent or officiated at the outer altar, so that they may not die. The impurity that they removed may have included some ordinary dirt, but the importance of this purification went far beyond what could be expected in a non-cultic context. Third, as elsewhere in the A&E, impurities were generally to be avoided if possible, but if they were incurred, they were to be remedied by means of appropriate purification rituals. Incurring some Israelite physical impurities, such as secondary contamination by touching a person having a genital flow, or tertiary, that is third level, contamination by contacting an object that the person had made impure, was to be avoided if possible. However, some impurities could not be avoided because they resulted from involuntary bodily functions, such as healthy or unhealthy genital flows or scaly skin disease. Others were permitted and even necessary, such as the impurity resulting from sexual intercourse that was needed to maintain and grow the nation, and incurring corpse impurity to bury dead relatives. Some impurities were forbidden, at least to some categories of Israelites. For example, all Israelites were prohibited from eating small, swarming creatures that would make them impure, and ordinary priests were not to become impure from corpses, except for those of close family members. Rituals for purification from light one-day impurities, such as those caused by male nocturnal emission, by sexual intercourse, or by secondary contamination through physical contact with a person having a genital flow, or by tertiary contamination through contact with an object made unclean by a person with a severe impurity resulting from a genital flow, were simple. All that was necessary was to wash one's clothes, bathe in water, and wait until the evening. However, purification from severe impurities, that is, from primary sources of impurity that continued for an extended period of time, also required sacrifices from the individuals undergoing purification. Corpse impurity was secondary contamination, but it was serious and lasted 7 days because of its close association with death. And it was transmitted not only by direct contact, but also to anyone under the same roof. So purification required the red cow purification offering. But this was offered for the whole community, and individuals only needed to be sprinkled by a small amount of its ashes mixed with water on the 3rd and 7th days. Fourth, physical impurity itself was not sin, as shown by the fact that Israelites who offered sacrifices to remove their physical impurities needed and received purification, but not forgiveness. However, violation of a rule concerning impurity, for example by incurring a prohibited impurity or failing to undergo timely purification, was a sin. Fifth, Israelite physical impurity conflicted with the holy domain of the deity. This was not only because such impurity showed lack of decorum and respect to Adonai, but because he is the God of life, the Creator, who must not be associated with impurity that comes from death and the birth-to-death cycle of mortality that results from sin. Therefore, the Israelites were to keep impurities away from sacred places and objects. For example, a woman with a flow of blood following childbirth was not permitted to enter the sanctuary precincts. It was categorically forbidden for an Israelite to eat meat from a holy well-being offering while in a state of physical impurity, and the penalty for the sin of violating this rule was cutting off. Failure to undergo purification from corpse impurity even defiled the sanctuary from a distance, and the penalty was cutting off. The next section continues to discuss Israelite cult, but it refers to another element that makes Israelite cult unique. Israelite cult affected by remedies for sins and other impurities. Thus far, we have found that Israelites and other A&E peoples shared key concepts regarding sins and other impurities, although there were some differences between them. A&E people could sin or incur other impurities so that they would need to offer expiatory sacrifices or undergo purification, and their sacred places and objects could become impure so that they would require periodic purification. But never did their remedies for personal sins or impurities cause these evils to pollute their temples or sancta in any way, and there is no evidence that purification of holy spaces and or their contents ever removed any effects of expiation or purification of sins or impurities of individuals. These were entirely separate. By contrast, there was one important feature of the Israelite ritual system that was completely unique. Purification offerings, in Hebrew chatat sacrifices, so-called sin offerings, that removed residual defilements of minor sins and what had been serious physical impurities from those who offered them, left some defilement at Adonai's sanctuary residence and on his priests. So this defilement had to be purified from the sanctuary with its sacred furniture once per year on the Day of Atonement. Thus, individual expiation and purification were linked to purgation of sacred space and objects. Remarkably, the ritual remedy prescribed by the deity for problems of persons negatively affected that deity at his sanctuary residence throughout the year until the Day of Atonement. The remainder of this paper analyzes the ritual details and their implications. Transfer of sins and impurities to the sanctuary throughout the year. Leviticus 4:1 to 5:13 presents the primary instructions for performance of purification offerings, which remedied inadvertent sins and minor sins of omission, mainly due to forgetfulness. The ritual procedure began with the offerer laying one hand on the head of the animal victim, after which he killed the animal, presumably by slitting its throat. A priest collected the blood in a container and applied it to part of the sanctuary, after which he disposed of the remainder of the blood by pouring it out at the base of the outer altar in the courtyard. Then the offerer removed specified parts of suet, that is hard fat, and burned the suet on the outer altar. So that's what's common to the different kinds of purification offerings. Now here there were two basic kinds of purification offerings, in that they differed in some key details. The first kind applied if the sacrifice remedied a sin that involved the entire community, whether it was committed by the high priest, who represented the community before Adonai, or by the entire community itself. The high priest took the blood into the sanctuary tent, sprinkled some of it 7 times in the area of the outer sanctum in front of the inner veil, and put some of it on the 4 horns of the altar of incense. After the high priest burned the suet, that's the hard fat, on the altar, the rest of the animal carcass was disposed of by incinerating it outside the camp in a pure place, excluding, for example, a place of human burial, which would not be pure. A purification offering to expiate a sin committed by a chieftain or common Israelite could be officiated by an ordinary priest, who would only put blood on the horns of the outer altar. This procedure, officiated by an ordinary priest, was the same when a purification offering remedied physical impurities. Leviticus 4 does not say what should be done with the rest of the animal. However, Leviticus 6 answers this question in the context of additional instructions that were especially for the priests. Quote, "The priest who offers it as a purification offering will eat it. It must be eaten in a holy place in the meeting tent's courtyard." A purification offering could be supplemented by a burnt offering so that the combination would amount to a greater purification offering. Thus, for example, a poor person who could not afford a sheep or goat for a purification offering could instead offer 2 birds, first one for a purification offering and the other as a burnt offering. The function of this pair was equivalent to that of a single purification offering. The function of purification offerings throughout the year to remedy sins was to expiate, that is, effect removal. The Hebrew is kippur, which is the peel of the root kapar, on behalf of the offerers, in this case the sinners, from, and that's the privative use of the preposition min, from their sins. That is, the sin was removed from the offerers. If the problem was physical impurity rather than sin, a purification offering effected removal for the offerer from, also privative preposition min, that person's impurity, that is, removing the impurity from the offerer. Jacob Milgram, who was my teacher, has argued that sins would be removed from sinners by repentance and physical impurities would be removed from impure persons by washing with water before they would offer purification offerings. Therefore, in his view, purification offerings would not remove evils from their offerers. James A. Greenberg, in a publication that just came out this year, a book called A New Look at Atonement in Leviticus, The Meaning and Purpose of Kippur Revisited, he agrees with Milgram because an impure person would not even be allowed to come to the sanctuary to offer a sacrifice. Therefore, the argument is that the person has already been purified before they come to the sanctuary. But he, like Milgram, does not adequately recognize that purification from severe impurity took place in stages that progressively diminished and then removed the impurity. And I talk about that in my book, Cult and Character. For example, in the case of a woman who has given birth to a boy, for the first 7 days, she has contagious impurity as during menstruation, so that she communicates impurity to persons and objects through touch. For the next 33 days, her impurity is not contagious in that way. But she is still forbidden to touch anything holy or enter the sanctuary precincts until her time of purification is completed. Then, when her time of purification is complete, whether for a son or a daughter, the mother must bring a 1-year-old lamb as an entirely burnt offering and a pigeon or turtle dove as a purification offering to the priest at the meeting tent's entrance. By now, her impurity is weak enough so that she can come to the sanctuary, where the purification offering, supplemented by the burnt offering, removes the last residue of impurity. She will then be cleansed from her blood flow. The additional instructions in Leviticus 6:20-21 add the following regulations regarding the purification offering. If some of its blood splashes on a garment, you must wash the bloodied part in a holy place. A pottery container in which the purification offering is cooked must be broken, but if it is cooked in a bronze container, that must be scrubbed and rinsed with water. That's Leviticus 6:20-21 in Hebrew. In English translations, it's verses 27-28, in case anyone is listening and wanting to look at the English. Because the purification offering was most holy, and the priests were required to eat it in a holy place, and anything that touched its flesh became holy, most scholars have interpreted these verses to mean that the reason for washing the bloodied part of a garment and for breaking or scrubbing and rinsing a vessel in which the meat is cooked for the priests is to remove contagious holiness. That is, holiness that could then affect other things, the way impurity affects other things. However, this interpretation does not work because, as pointed out by Jacob Milgram and David P. Wright, who was my classmate studying under Milgram, these rules concerning bloodied garments and cooking vessels only applied to purification offerings. If the rules dealt with sancticontagion, they would necessarily also apply to reparation offerings, which were also most holy, and made things holy by direct contact. But there is no evidence that reparation offerings were subject to these regulations. So they must be required by the unique dynamics of purification offerings, which serve the function of removing sins and physical impurities. Therefore, what was to be removed by washing the bloodied part of a garment and breaking or scrubbing and rinsing a vessel was not holiness, but defilement from the sin or impurity that was removed from the offerer by means of his or her animal victim. There is no solid evidence elsewhere in the Israelite ritual system for ritual removal of holiness, and I discuss in Cult and Character the case of the high priest's washing after he has been cleansing the sanctuary from impurities, and that's in Leviticus 16:24. That I have shown is not an example of ritual removal of holiness by that washing. But there is plenty of evidence for washing impurity from garments. There is also evidence for breaking earthenware vessels that have become impure. Sancticontagion does not make good sense in Leviticus 6:20-21. Aside from the points already mentioned, if purification offering blood spatters on a priest's garment, or he boils the meat in a vessel, why would sancticontagion matter? The priest's garment is already holy and belongs to the sanctuary, and presumably so do the vessels used to boil such meat there. If the concern of verse 20 is restricted to clothes of laypersons, which could be confiscated if holiness were not removed from them, and does not also apply to priest garments, why doesn't the text say so? On the other hand, impurity from the offerer makes sense because it would be a problem for both lay and priestly garments. If purification offering animals, including their blood, bore defilement that was removed from their offerers, we can understand why such blood was never physically applied to the offerers. Why put the sins or impurities back on the offerers when their ritual purpose was to remove the evils from them? Now consider this. If purification offering blood carried defilement that could be transferred to an object, such as a garment that came in contact with the blood, what happened when the priest applied such blood from the same animal to the sanctuary, whether in the outer sanctum and on the horns of the incense altar or on the horns of the outer altar? The ritual activity would have communicated defilement to the sanctuary. This explains how Hatat sins and physical impurities got into the sanctuary so that they had to be purged from there on the annual Day of Atonement. Next section, weakness of defilements affecting the holy sanctuary. An objection to the interpretation that Leviticus 6:20-21 concerns impurity is the fact that the purification offering was most holy and was to be eaten in a holy place. How could such a sacrifice carry defilement from sin or physical impurity that came from the offerer? We have seen that elsewhere in the Israelite ritual system, holiness and impurity were antagonistic and had to be kept apart from each other. For example, Leviticus 7:20-21. Following instructions in Leviticus 15 concerning treatment of impurities from genital flows, verse 31 warns, quote, "You must separate the Israelites from their uncleanness so that they don't die on account of it by making my dwelling unclean, which is in their midst," unquote. However, we cannot escape the biblical evidence. Paradoxically, purification offerings bore defilement, even though Leviticus 6 repeatedly affirms that they were most holy. It was not their purpose to bear this defilement. Their function was to remove sins or physical impurities from offerers. The defilement that they carried was an inevitable side effect. There is no question that the sanctuary bore pollution because Leviticus 16 says that it was removed from there on the Day of Atonement. Lessening the problem of defilement brought into the holy sanctuary by purification offerings is the fact that this defilement would be very minor. These sacrifices did remedy what had been serious physical impurities, but remember that the impurities were weakened before the individuals undergoing purification were allowed to come to the sanctuary in order to offer the sacrifices. If they could enter the sacred precincts while carrying a residue of impurity without disrupting the holiness of the sanctuary, it would be less problematic for the sanctuary to bear an even weaker trace amount of pollution that was tertiary, that is, third level contamination, because it was transmitted from a person to an animal and then by a priest to the sanctuary. Remember that in the Israelite system of impurities, secondary and tertiary impurities resulting from contact with the primary source of impurity were weaker than the impurity of that source. Regarding defilement of the sanctuary from Hatat sins, this was mitigated or lessened by the fact that purification offerings only remedied minor sins. These included unintentional sins, sins of temporarily forgetting to fulfill duties, to undergo timely physical purification, or to fulfill vows or oaths, or temporarily withholding testimony regarding crimes committed by others. Repentance of the sinners, as indicated by their bringing purification offerings to the sanctuary to receive expiation, in some cases after required confession, presumably further lessened the defilement. Then the small amount of remaining pollution went from the offerer to the sacrificial victim, and only then by the priest to the sanctuary, again as tertiary defilement. Notice the following points. First, the fact that sins expiated by purification offerings caused defilement that polluted the sanctuary, a physical structure with sacred space, exemplifies the fact that sin is a form of impurity. Another example is the ritual of Azazel's goat on the Day of Atonement. That's the so-called scapegoat. Scapegoat is a mistranslation, because in Leviticus 16, verse 10, the goat is sent to Azazel. So if Azazel means scapegoat, then the goat is sent to the goat, and that doesn't work. Okay, so I call it Azazel's goat, a goat that belongs to some kind of personal being who is not Adonai, actually his enemy, who is called Azazel. Okay, so this example is the ritual of Azazel's goat on the Day of Atonement. The goat carries only sins, that is, moral faults, but the man who leads it into the wilderness must subsequently undergo physical purification by laundering his clothes and bathing. Second, while purification offerings transferred defilements to the sanctuary only in trace amounts throughout the year, the defilements accumulated so that they had to be removed once per year in order to not become excessive. Third, all of these defilements were symbolic and abstract. They did not exist in physical form. The next section is removal of sins and impurities from the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest removed the sins and impurities that had accumulated at the sanctuary throughout the year by means of special purification offerings in which he applied the blood to the various parts of the sanctuary: the inner sanctum, the outer sanctum, and the outer altar. The carcasses of the animals which absorbed the defilements were incinerated outside the camp. Leviticus 16:16 lists the evils that the high priest purged from the inner sanctum, called here the holy place, and the outer sanctum, which is the rest of the tent of meeting. It's just called tent of meeting, but it really means the rest of the tent of meeting, because elsewhere the whole sanctuary can be called the tent of meeting. These were physical impurities, pesha sins, and chatat sins. The high priest also applied blood to the outer altar to remove these impurities and moral faults, which were abbreviated by referring to the impurities, the first item in the list, to remove these impurities and moral faults from it, that is from the altar, and to reconsecrate it. Notice that although purification offerings throughout the year only involved application of blood to the outer altar in cases of physical impurity, and mostly to that altar in cases of sins, the impurities and sins affected the inner sanctum and the outer sanctum. The outer altar was an integral part of the sanctuary, so what happened to it affected the entire sanctuary, part for all. The effects of human problems impacted all of Adonai's residence, including the inner sanctum and the Ark of the Covenant, above which he was enthroned above and between the cherubim. The chatat sins removed from the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement were those that were expiated by purification offerings throughout the year. But the pesha sins are only mentioned in Leviticus 16, verses 16 and 21, in the context of the Day of Atonement, in all of Pentateuchal ritual law. There were no sacrifices for such sins, so they could not have entered the sanctuary through purification offerings as impurities and chatat sins did. Therefore, it appears that the pesha sins, which can be translated as rebellious sins, came to the sanctuary through automatic defilement caused by egregious sins, that is, really bad sins, such as Moloch worship and willful failure to undergo purification from corpse impurity. Such defilement of the sanctuary from a distance is only attested in these cases. While these sins had to be purged from the sanctuary, this did not benefit those who committed them, who were cut off. The penalty was terminal, so the sinners had no opportunity to gain expiation through animal sacrifices. Jacob Milgram has argued that chatat sins, which were expiable by purification offerings, also automatically defiled the sanctuary from a distance. But there is no real evidence for this. The next section is culpability transferred to priests. If purification offering blood that spattered on a garment contaminated it, and such blood that the priest applied to the outer altar or inside the outer sanctum transmitted defilement to the sanctuary, what happened to priests when they ate the meat of purification offerings, that is, from the same animals? Vessels in which such meat was cooked became impure, so that they had to be broken or cleansed. This indicates that the meat, like the blood, carried some defilement, which the priests who ate the meat would receive. Moses made this explicit when he asked the priests in Leviticus 10:17 why they had not eaten the inaugural purification offering on behalf of the community in the holy precincts. He reminded them that the sacrifice was most holy and had been assigned to them, that is, to eat, in order to bear the culpability, Hebrew avon, usually translated iniquity, but here it is culpability that is consequential liability that results from a sin. So they were to bear the culpability of the community by expiating for them before Adonai. Culpability was the consequential liability, that is, punishability that resulted from committing a sin. For example, in Leviticus 5, verse 1, if a person sins in a certain way, he bears his culpability unless he confesses and offers a purification offering. When a priest eats the purification offering, he receives the culpability. In this way, a priest who mediates for the people participates in bearing culpability as he does. Culpabilities must be borne by the priests, not by the physical sanctuary structure or space, because only persons can be liable for punishment. However, the priest does not actually end up suffering the punishment, whether because the culpability is weakened when it is transferred to another person, or because the priest is immune to the culpability, or because the culpability is removed from him on the Day of Atonement to the live goat for Azazel, which carries culpabilities into the wilderness. We have found that purification offerings to remedy minor hatat sins and physical impurities resulted in the transfer of weak defilement to the sanctuary, and purification offerings for minor sins, but not physical impurities, caused priests to bear the culpabilities that were transferred to them from the sinners. These dynamics were limited to purification offerings, which involved only weak defilement, probably in order to avoid desecrating the sanctuary so that its function as Yahweh's residence would cease because he would leave. So in other words, this system specifically deals with lesser sins because more serious sins would have had greater consequences for the sanctuary. And so this was a way to teach certain things without causing difficulty. Why would Adonai, who according to the Pentateuchal narrative is the source of ritual instructions, direct that purification offering remedies would defile his sanctuary as a necessary side effect of intentional ritual processes? The God of the Israelites provided them with ritual solutions to their problems of sins and of physical impurities, representing the disease of mortality resulting from sin, by making himself vulnerable due to the temporary defilement of his sanctuary residence and culpability carried by his servants, the priests. This shows his unique willingness to do all he could to help human beings who could not remedy their problems on their own, even if it involved sacrifice on his part. In cases of sin, purification offerings provided expiation, prerequisite to divine forgiveness. As the one who granted pardon, Adonai functioned as Israel's supreme judge. The role of a judge is to vindicate those who are innocent and to condemn those who are guilty. A judge is not supposed to forgive the guilty, which would extend mercy without adequate justice. But that is exactly what God does. So he bears judicial responsibility for forgiving sinners, just as King David, as judge, would bear such responsibility for pardoning a murderer if his mother, that is the mother of the murderer, the woman of Tekoa, did not offer to bear it for him. This is in 2 Samuel 14, verse 9, in the context of a juridical parable, so that that murderer really existed in a story that was told by this woman of Tekoa within a certain context to persuade David to make a decision about his son Absalom. But it also, this juridical parable, demonstrates real-life dynamics of justice. God bears judicial responsibility as represented by defilement of his sanctuary residence headquarters and the bearing of culpability by his priests until the Day of Atonement, Israel's judgment day, when purgation of his sanctuary shows that he is vindicated for having forgiven the right people who remain repentant and loyal to him. He is also vindicated for condemning those who do not show loyalty to him on this day. Therefore, the two stages of treating Hatat sins, first to remove them from the sinners and then to purge them from the sanctuary, both of which are carried out by purification offerings, constitute a ritual enactment of theodicy, which is justification of God's character in dealing with sin. The fact that he forgives shows his mercy. The fact that an expiatory sacrifice is prerequisite to forgiveness and it defiles his sanctuary so that it must be cleansed, representing his vindication, shows his justice. He is fully just as he extends mercy, as expressed in Psalm 85, verse 11, and that's verse 10 in English. Quote, faithfulness and truth meet, justice and well-being kiss. That's the greatest romance in the universe. Justice and mercy are the two sides of God's love. Therefore, God is love, as demonstrated by the ancient Israelite ritual system. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, because you also make exactly on time. So thank you so much. And I don't think it was easy for many of our listeners. First of all, it is a difficult topic, I would assume. But I would like to open the floor for questions or comments. Slowly, we still have time. So, comments. Thank you. Thank you very much. We will have to stop here, though there are many more questions, I'm sure. So thank you all for coming today, and those of you who wish to take part in tomorrow's lecture, please come. You are most welcome.
More discussion. So if anyone has any questions that you didn't get answered today, then tomorrow's is going to tie in with this to some extent, and you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions tomorrow. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.